Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riding from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer. With me once again is my good friend Deb Romero, certified Alexander Technique instructor. So today's topic is the third episode on the one paper. The title of the paper, which I will put in the notes, is Spinal Biomechanics and Functional Anatomy by Jean-Marie D. Denoix, Denoix, DVM and PhD. So we have been sort of discussing this paper this is our third podcast on discussing it. And it's just a pretty pivotal paper. And today's discussion is more on the segment of the paper that talks about lateroflexion and rotation as functions of the equine spine. Well, I think people have them too.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about that. And to me, this is one of the most important aspects of this particular paper, because before Denoix, a lot of our understanding of the function of rotation was somewhat limited.
I didn't even ever think about it.
Even though you knew about it in people.
Yeah, I just never transferred that thought to riding, to horses.
So for this segment on lateral bending and rotation, what were some of the first things that struck you? Just in a general way.
In a general way, one can't happen without the other. That's what kind of stood out for me.
That you can't have any lateral bending without influencing the function of rotation, even though they're separated functions, because we're talking two different dimensions, but they're intimately connected.
Yes. And yeah, that to me was amazing. And I feel it when I ride.
Oh, you
I
can't.
never thought about putting those two things together.
Exactly. And it's so important when we ride, because we tend to think in terms of either the spine is straight or we're bending the spine on the shape of the turn or the shape of the circle. And rotation as a function was never in the mental mix for us.
Right. I think it's because, and maybe it's just me, but it's that linear type of thinking. Like you said, the straight spine, that's kind of a linear thought to me, where the body is so dynamic. There's so much going on at one time. We just don't realize it.
Right. No, and even before I really knew the technical ins and outs of rotation function, I realized just through trial and error that there was an aspect to riding that was related to bending or straightness that I sort of called the ball rolling, like the barrel of the horse, right? If you think of it like a ball moving through space, there's a rolling aspect to the torso of the horse that I noticed before I really understood rotation. And that rolling aspect and how it's related to like a levelness of the horse's back during a turn, especially, was really challenging.
Yes.
And I went, like I noticed it and went, there's the reason I'm losing the shoulders. There's the reason
good point.
I'm losing direction, because the whole barrel had this capacity to roll side to side from our perspective in the saddle. That's rotation.
Yeah. I guess I noticed it the most. I tell this to people because a lot of people don't get it. When I say it's a rotation, is going down a hill. You can really feel it.
The swinging.
The swinging. Yeah, it's that swinging.
Right. So where we talk about lateral bending of a horse's spine all day, every day in current horsemanship, nobody's talking about this levelness aspect through the back and the pelvis.
It's a good way to put it.
Right. So I realized what we call straight on a horse really has two dimensions minimum. And that's what Jean-Marie Denoix really goes into in this paper, is it literally is two interrelated but separate functions of the spine, that if we really want our horse to find balance, we have to address this lateral rolling aspect that's related to rotation, as well as side bending or straightness of the spine or side bending of the spine. And the first thing that struck me, sort of like when we talked about the up and down of dorsal ventral flexion and extension, was that there's more capacity for lateral bending and rotational displacement or movement in some vertebra.
Yeah.
It's not congruently the same in degrees throughout the whole spine.
Yep.
That there's areas of the spine that have more mobility for lateral bending and rotation compared to other areas of the spine. And so the image we all saw and this used to be, I think, the science related to the biomechanics of the horse, is that we were sort of told that the space between each vertebra of the spine is going to have an equal amount of lateral bending. So when we go on a circle, straight on a circle was sort of the idea that the spine arcs to the same degree from head to tail. And Jean-Marie Denoix is sort of pointing out it's not going to happen.
Right. And if you think about it skeletally, that makes sense.
Absolutely.
If you think about it down to the bones and the entire skeleton, you go, oh yeah, well, that makes sense that maybe the lumbar and the sacral can't move as much, just structurally the way they're put together.
Right, because the shape of all the vertebral bones are not the same.
I don't know if people know that. It's the same in people.
Yeah, very different. So like even our lumbar spine has much longer sideways bones, or the, what do you call them? The transverse processes. Yeah. So we have the dorsal processes and the transverse processes. And so if you think about it, that's going to restrict, just the shape of the bones is going to restrict degrees of lateral bending compared to the bones that don't have these big transverse processes. So let's start off with just kind of the definition, what he's talking about technically with lateral flexion and rotation. Because this itself was so confusing to me when I first started learning about flexion and rotation. Okay, so a left lateroflexion is defined as a bending of the vertebral column presenting a left concavity and a right convexity. So everything shortens on the left, widens on the right. A left rotation is defined as a left shifting of the ventral aspect of the vertebral body, or a right shifting of the spinous processes, which is the top. So the point of reference for right or left is the bottom of the bone rather than the top of the bone, which as a rider, I found so confusing. Because I was like, that can't be right. Because technically,
it's anatomical language. They do the same thing with people. So I was used to that. So it's always that side.
Right. So when I discovered, like, technically on a left lateral bend, we should have technically right rotation.
Yeah. So to me, that would mean that the horse is higher on the right on a left turn. Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is, so if we talk about the bones, and so in the way it finally stuck with me is, if we take our hand and we say the palm is sort of the vertebral bodies and our fingertips are the dorsal tips, then if we laterally cup our hand, right? So we have a left concavity and a right convexity on my right hand, then the dorsal tips are going to the right, but the knuckles of my finger are going to,
Mm,
or sorry, the tips of my fingers are going left and the knuckles of my finger are going to the right.
okay.
So technically, it's so natural. Like if we just cup our hand with a little bit of lateral bending, our fingertips go in the same direction as the bend. And so that is lateral bending with ideal rotation. But we can
Okay.
have too much in the
Oh, there you go.
direction, right? But what so when we have a little bit of lateral bending through the spine, the up and down portion of the spine, or actually it's a twisting motion coupled with a lateral bending motion,
Yeah.
right? So the bottom part of the bones are going away from the direction of bend, but the dorsal tips, which is what we feel as riders,
Right.
are really going in the same direction as the bend, technically. But
Technically.
we'll get into that because what that feels like is a little different than what's actually happening.
Exactly.
So we can have the problem of, like when we're riding, let's say we ask the horse for a left lateral bend. Experientially, what we feel is either the barrel is going to roll too far in the same direction as the bend, which is excessive rotation. It's not, it's the right direction, but it's too much. And that's how horses fall on the inside shoulder or fall in on a turn or overload the inside front leg. And they basically are rolling the barrel in the same direction of the bend. So even though that is technically the right direction of rotation, it can be excessive.
I think that's really important to know that there can be too much.
Yes. And at a certain point, like especially when we overbend the neck and misalign the lower cervical spine to the upper thoracic spine, then a horse can also place the dorsal tips against the direction of the bend. So we can have left lateral rotation with, and this is what screwed me up. It would be left rotation. Left lateral bending with left rotation is actually inverted rotation. It's the wrong way.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
But the point of reference is the ventral side. So as a rider, it's much easier to sort of think from the top perspective because we're sitting on the top of the spine.
I agree with that.
So what we're really looking for is on a left lateral bend, we should feel the dorsal tips. What they really do is what you feel as a rider, I should say, not what they really do, but what we feel as a rider is an uprightness to the dorsal tips where they spiral. There's a kind of a spiraling energy in the direction of the bend, but not a leaning of the dorsal tips in the direction of the bend. As soon as we can feel the dorsal tips leaning either into the bend, direction of lateral bend, or against the direction of lateral bend, we have too much. We have destabilized rotation. My kitty cat wants to help today. So, so too much rotation or the wrong direction of rotation can both cause problems and will always be coupled with lateral bending.
Yes.
So the idea that we have to get the internal midline of the horse on the same degree of curve as a turn or a circle actually promotes rotational dysfunction. Did I say that out loud?
Can you say that?
I know. Did I really say that out loud?
Did you say that?
I did. Jean-Marie backs me up on this. Yes. I know.
It's the banana theory.
I know. It's the banana theory. So if our horse feels like a banana internally through the midline on a turn, we more than likely have a rotation problem, which means the barrel, the whole barrel of the horse is either going to roll too much in the direction of bend, or it's going to actively roll against the direction of bend. So if it rolls in the direction of the bend, what we think we have all the time is a shoulder issue.
It's
But it's
true.
the whole barrel,
It's the whole
right?
thing.
It's the whole barrel. It's not just the shoulders.
Or I think an easy way, it's more extreme, but when you're trying to turn your horse, say, to the right, and you're using this big rein theory, and the whole horse goes to the left.
Yeah, because once the barrel rolls in the direction of the bend, the horse only has two options: how to compensate through the shoulders for the excess rolling motion of
True.
the spine or the whole barrel. So they're going to compensate by either overloading the inside front leg on a turn, dropping the shoulder is what we call it, or they're going to escape by pushing the outside shoulder outward as a way to try to find stability for all of this force that's rolling in the direction of the bend. So like you see all the time, it still makes me smile. You go, watch somebody ride and they're pulling on that left rein as hard as they can. And the horse is just drifting out to the right more and more and more and more and not making the turn.
Yeah.
Right. Or with young horses, like anybody who's ever started a green horse, because balancing on a turn or a circle is more challenging to a horse than making transitions in speed. It's much more challenging for them to balance on a turn than it is to transition up and down. So green horses will typically go into a turn with the rotation going the wrong direction. So we're trying to bend the neck to the left, but the whole barrel is sort of rolling towards the right, which is going to push the rider up on the inside seat bone and drop the rider to the outside. It's also the barrel's going to push inward against our inside calf. And again, that's where we think the problem is. The horse won't get off your inside leg. Right. So everybody's like banging harder and harder with their inside leg. But as long as our body weight is going with the barrel, it's like you've just created an opposing force that changes nothing.
You can't. That's too much force to handle with one of our legs.
Right. So it's super important. I think it's one of the most important parts of balancing a horse is to understand the relationship between, well, first to understand what rotation is, because it's not talked about in the training business.
I don't ever in all of my years ever remember talking about it.
I've had two mentors that talked about it and I learned more about it. And I kind of discovered intuitively this rolling of the barrel that was a big problem. And it's so common. Like, how many people, their horse comes to a halt and they jerk the saddle back up level?
Now run that by me again.
So people on trail rides or in performance, it's like we come to a halt and all of a sudden we realize our saddle is way over to one side. So we step in the other stirrup and kind of go and put our saddle upright again. Like, how common is that? That is so common.
Oh, and then don't even get into saddle fitting to that and the flocking and.
Well, and again, our first thought is, oh, I need a better girth. My girth is too loose, or I need a tighter girth or a stickier girth, or I need a pad that doesn't slip. And our human response is, why is my saddle doing this? Which makes me laugh, because your saddle is an inanimate object. It's not doing anything, right?
That's a good point.
The saddle is succumbing to the forces generated by the horse or the rider. It's not doing anything by itself. Like, your saddle doesn't slip off the saddle rack, right?
Well.
And it's such a problem that a lot of saddle fitters, it's not uncommon, and I always have my clients double check this, it's not uncommon at all for saddle fitters to overflock one side of the saddle,
Yes.
right? To make the rider balanced, but it kind of locks the horse. It tells us if our saddle flocking, especially if it's wool flocking, is compressing more on one side, we have a rotation problem.
We definitely have a rotation problem.
And if our saddle is slipping to one side regularly, we have a rotation problem coupled with lateral bending. And I've even had clients tell me that past trainers told them they had one leg shorter than the other.
Oh, don't go there again.
I know, which makes me think of your client. But it's like people will ride with one stirrup length a couple holes shorter than the
I've
other
heard of that.
all the time. It's not uncommon at all. And think that they have one shorter leg. But if you actually took a video of the rider, the other thing we see all the time is an unlevel belt line on the rider. Like the hips will be higher on one side and the rider's rib cage will be collapsed on one side. That's how our body responds to rotation issues in the horse. Right. So we're kind of digressing from the paper, but all of that stuff, the point is, rotation is a problem, is an issue, I should say, not necessarily a problem, but stabilizing rotation and getting the rotation functionally correct with lateral bending is an issue for every horse I've ever sat on.
Me too.
Like without exception.
Me too. Yeah. And it changes. It's so dynamic.
Of course it changes.
And a horse can one day, yesterday when I rode, it was to the left. It might not be that way today. So
if we're effective, it's not going to be the same.
Right.
Right. But it's such a common problem that nobody talks about. And so sort of knowing that if we feel like one stirrup is too long and the other is too short, if our saddle keeps going off to one side, if our flocking wears down unevenly, all of that stuff, all of those are indicative of habitual rotational dysfunction, which can also mean our horse holds an invisible lateral bend that we don't really recognize. Because if you have a rotation issue, you have a lateral bend issue and vice versa.
Right, because they go together.
Or that the very thing we were taught, that our horse should feel like a banana, the same shape as the circle, is creating prevalent dysfunctional rotation.
Yes, and he states in here somewhere about how that can possibly cause pain in horses with kissing spine.
Oh, yes, I underlined that part.
Yeah.
Do you have it?
Yeah, I do. It's on page 45.
You want to read it?
Maybe not 45. Wait a second.
Oh, yes. So each vertebral body is prone to... No.
This is it's on page 47. Says, in horses presented with impinged spinous process or kissing spines due to the transverse displacement of the spinous processes, lateral flexion may be a movement contributing to the generation of pain, especially when the vertebral column is in extension.
Absolutely.
Bingo. I read that and went, oh.
Yes. So that idea of having to make our horse's midline bend on the shape of the circle, if the back is also pushing down, which again, not uncommon.
Not uncommon at all, even in high competition.
Yeah, that can be contributing to significant pain.
Yeah.
And so horses,
was amazing to me.
Like what that translates into for me on a really practical level is a horse that's really violently resisting the turn is telling you something is wrong. Right? So horses that don't turn well or that really go into anxiety or tension or chomping the bit or pushing against our leg during a turn or during a circle, they're letting us know there is an issue here that's not being addressed.
Yeah.
right? And if we have a horse with kissing spine, which is also, we talked about, related to the downward force of the spine or extension, and we're bending laterally, oh boy, that's the moment I think I got bucked off.
Ha, I bet.
Yeah. No, my horse that had kissing spine, he went to take off and I tried to stop him straight and had to turn him a little, and he went into a bucking frenzy.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was one of those where you see your boots against the sky kind of buck off. It was, yeah, that's what pain issues get you. It's like, oh, there's my boots on the way down, out of control. So the thing that struck me too about not being equal throughout the vertebral bodies is that the greatest amount, so the amount of these movements, he's talking, I'm picking up from lateral flexion and rotation. The amount of these movements is greatest in the second half of the thoracic spine in the segment extending from T9 to T14. That's basically the base of the withers to about where our seat bones are.
Yeah.
Not a big
amazing.
area. That's where we're going to feel the most amount of lateral bending and rotation. Well, that's where the mobility for lateral bending and rotation is the greatest. Let's put it that way. So if we're bending the neck past the point that T9 to T14 can laterally bend, it usually, for the horse's spinal cord to prevent snapping, the dorsal tips of the spine will go away from the direction of the bend.
Okay, that makes sense.
Into inverted rotation, right? It can go too much in the direction of the bend, like we talked about. But if we feel the horse falling, overturning in the direction we asked, then the rotation, the dorsal tips are too far in the direction of the bend. If we feel the horse pushing against our calf and resisting the turn at all, then the dorsal tips of the spine are rotating the opposite way.
Yes.
Which is inverted rotation. So depending
and
on where
I've had both happen on the same horse, going different directions. You know, it can happen anywhere.
Oh, absolutely. It's a moment to moment. As soon as the horse starts to lose control over lateral bending or rotation, you're going to have the barrel rolling one side or the other. And that can be completely dependent on what's happening in the moment. There's no there's no predictability to it.
Not at all. You have to be very adaptable.
Yeah. Now, that said, when I have horses that have behavioral issues or performance issues, even especially lameness issues, I have yet to meet a horse with lameness issues that doesn't have a rotation lateral bending issue.
That makes total sense, because it's gonna, if the spine in the human isn't being used correctly, the kinematics of the arms and legs is not going to be correct. So I'm assuming with horses, if the horse's spine is not being used correctly, it affects the kinematics of the legs. And that's where we usually see it first, but that's just the symptom. That's not the cause.
Right. Right. Yeah. And like horses that develop navicular changes on one front leg, ring bone, side bone, any kind of lameness that's on one front leg, if it's not an injury or an accident, it very frequently has to do with habitual dysfunctional rotation. Because the other thing horses can do is, if they're on the forehand, or if they're just generally unstable, they can fix the dorsal tips of the spine and a little bit of lateral bending to one side as a way to find stability.
That's what I have in my big mare. She, and I never put this together until we started talking about rotation. She always holds her tail to the right. And I didn't think about it, but years later, I found out she was fixated on her thoracics between her shoulder blades to the left. So there's this common duality thing going on.
A counterbalance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's taken years to get her unstuck.
quadrupeds can create these amazing counterbalances that we have a hard time imagining. And that's why they can be really dysfunctional, but still not fall over,
Right.
still perform, even though the mechanics are, drastically dysfunctional, they still perform. But what we usually get is what we call a behavioral issue, a personality flaw. We blame it on other things. Or we say
Good
the horse,
point.
oh, disrespectful. Oh, I hate it when people say my horse is disrespectful. Disrespectful of what? The fact that you're not listening to the problem?
Yeah.
Oh, so I'm trying to think where else I wanted to pick up. So the maximum amount of lateral bending and rotation is going to be between T9 and T14. So when we actually, like, there's a big difference between incorrect lateral bending and correct lateral bending. So incorrect lateral bending is just sort of pulling the neck sideways or asking our horse to move off of our leg to the point that we excessively create concavity. The horse moves away from our inside leg. That's always going to be coupled with a rotation problem, right? So as soon as we overbend the horse, the barrel will roll too far to the inside or too far to the outside. Correct lateral bending, to me, is defined by stabilizing rotation, and it's just a softening around the inside leg, but the neck looks straight. So as soon as you flex the pole laterally, left or right, just a tiny bit of lateral flexion through the upper cervical spine asks the entire spine to bend laterally. But instead of feeling like a banana, the horse feels straight.
Right. You don't feel, that too high on one side or the other.
Right. So as soon as as soon as the barrel rolls, we have incorrect lateral bending.
Yes.
Right. If the barrel can stay level and stable while we flex the neck left and right, then we have correct lateral bending.
Yes, I agree.
Right. And that's really how we know the difference. As soon as we get pushed up on one seat bone or the saddle pulls left and right, unseating our levelness, then we know we have excessive lateral bending or incorrect lateral bending.
Right.
And so that's how we can monitor during a turn, during lateral work, or during a circle. That's how we know how far we can bend a unique horse, left or right. As soon as that barrel becomes unstable and starts rolling inside or outside, it's too much for that horse.
Right.
Can't do it. Right. And so I get asked all the time, if the horse doesn't bend the spine on a circle, how do they turn? And I go, that's easy, because we don't walk around and bend sideways in order to turn.
Exactly. We'd fall over.
We would fall over. So they widen the legs, adduction and abduction. That's what gets the forelegs around a turn while the barrel remains level and the lateral bending is minimized. If used at all, you can ask for 0 lateral bending and still do a 6-meter circle.
Yes.
Like, you don't need lateral bending for any turn or any circle. It's entirely possible to do a turn or a circle resisting lateral bending and keeping the barrel level, which is upright rotation. So not necessary. And then it says between L4 or L5 and S1. So we're in the lumbar to sacral part of the spine. Because of the presence of the intertransverse joints, lateral flexion is virtually non-existent.
That makes sense.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. So from L4 to T18, going the other way towards the head, lateral flexion increases progressively in each intervertebral joint. So the transverse processes can overlap, like that's not a restriction to lateral bending, but It makes sense if the horse's hindquarters are really the origin of stability for the whole body. You're not going to have a lot of lateral mobility through the spine from the sacrum to the lumbar, from the pelvis and sacrum to up the lumbar, and it's going to increase as you move farther forward in the spine.
Yeah, and that other paper we talked about, there's a stabilizing muscle tendon in the lumbosacral area down into the tail.
Right, that muscle.
I can't remember the name of it, but I can see the picture. And it's like, well, that makes sense because that's where you have to have more stability.
Right. So the muscle that we call the tail head muscle, which is the CD something, I can't remember, but it's a muscle that starts at the third sacral joint and runs basically into the tail, all of the coccyx bones. That is the muscle fiber type of posture.
Yes.
So postural support. So that makes sense because if you cut the horse in half, the back half of the horse is meant to be the most stable part of the body with the least amount of mobility. And the front half of the horse is much more mobile and much more adaptable. So that's why if a horse is on the forehand, we have such crappy movement. If the front end is doing the job of stability, then the hind end is not. It's kind of one or the other.
Good point. Good point.
So what else caught your attention? I'm trying to look through some of my notes.
I think we touched on it a little bit, but that depending upon if the horse is in extension or flexion, the function between the discs, the vertebral bodies, can be quite different in different locations.
Yes.
And that somewhere it states about if the horse is in extension, that there is more shear.
Yes.
Happening, bone shearing happening than if the horse is in flexion. I think that was just a simple thing, that I found through the paper.
And it kind of, I think it was many, many podcasts ago, we actually sort of were not sure, knowing that there have to be an intervertebral discs like people, but really you never hear that talked about by vets or anybody. The discs between the vertebra in horses. And of course they have discs, otherwise the vertebra wouldn't slide, like they couldn't move.
Yeah.
And so he sort of answered that question in that in the equine spine, sliding and shearing movements are the most functional features of the intervertebral discs, which are lacking in Nucleus pulpus, or no, pulposus. Is that right? Pulpus.
Pulpus.
So I had to look that up. That's the fleshy, watery part of the discs. So humans have Nucleus pulpus.
In the middle, yeah.
In the middle, and horses don't. So their intervertebral discs are just more fibrous. They lack the fluid part of what we have. Yeah. So I was like, oh, of course they have intervertebral discs, but they don't have herniated discs like we have because they don't have that kind of watery, fleshy, mushy part. So I thought that was really interesting.
That's pretty interesting, actually.
Yeah. And then a big part of this paper goes into center of rotation and instant center of rotation. And it's fascinating because he actually really looked at in each vertebral body how the center of rotation, which is the middle of the movement of each vertebra, how that changes, whether the spine is pushing down into extension, upward into flexion, how that relates to rotation and lateral bending. And I found that fascinating. That I know the center of rotation actually moves location in the vertebral body. So when the spine is pushing down, the center of rotation moves upward and backward in the bone.
Yep.
So it's causing the bone to have a backwards force. And I go, so dropping the spine, and that's really related to our direct experience of the horse pushing the spine down,
Yes.
right? And so when the spine is pushing down, the direction of force is no longer forward motion, it's backwards.
It's backwards.
Yeah, it's a back and down, which is really confirmed by what he's saying about the instant center of rotation changing in the bone.
Yep.
And that inflection, that instant center of rotation shifts in the bone forward and downward. So that means where the bone is shifting is now lower, causing a forward energy.
Yes.
During flexion. So you have a forward energy, as well as, I think, with rotation. So that whole segment on the instant center of rotation, I think I had to read it like 6 times.
Me too.
To fully understand it. I'm like, okay, that's getting into the weeds. Like that's really getting into the detail.
In there.
Yeah. So I don't want to spend too much time on it other than what we feel as riders is, and this is how we know, because as riders, there's no way we're going to actually influence the movement of the bones when the more you realize how complex it is, how detailed it is, how specific it is, and segmented throughout the spine. I go, that's way too much for a leg aid to manage. Like, there's just no way you're going to get that done. But what we can feel are the directions of force that are generated by different uses of the spine. Right? So a barrel rolling tells us we have either unstable rotation function or fixed rotation function in the wrong place, or too much in the direction of a bend or against the direction of bend. Like we can feel all those forces as a rider. And so when we influence changing the direction of force, the horse has to figure out how to change the coordination and the function.
That's what I like. Yeah, I have taken with some people because they just don't, especially in movement, they can't feel the rotation because it can be very fast. You know, it can outdo us. Is I've had people actually just sit on their horse. And when the horse, you know, cocks a hind leg and throws the rider to one side, I say, that's rotation.
Yes.
That's what it is. And they're like, oh, okay.
Oh, I feel that all the time.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
But it can happen so fast when we're in movement. We might not pick it up until it's really big.
Right. No, and here again, one of these simple sentences in his paper nails it. In the cervical and thoracic vertebral column, rotation is always coupled with lateral flexion and vice versa.
Yes.
Right. In the thoracic spine, as is the case during lateral flexion, the spinous processes bend in the concavity, and left lateral flexion is spontaneously associated with right rotation. In a perfect world.
Yeah,
that's the idea.
Like my mare that's rotated stuck in the withers to the left, and the tail is to the right.
Right.
Right. I can feel that now, and it came out as some really weird things. You know, she could never take a step to the right with her front leg and bring her front leg away from her body. She couldn't do it because her spinous processes in the withers were stuck left, so she couldn't move her right leg.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and that's what we're always calling.
You're thinking, oh, you stupid horse, you can't do that. And then if you think about what's going on in the body, it's like, well, of course she can.
Of course she can't. No, it's impossible. You're asking a physical impossible. You're asking her to play Twister in the middle of your circle. Yes. You know, and that is because our language as riders and trainers is always about shoulders and rib cages.
Wow,
get the ribs to soften against your leg. Move the ribs. That's
interesting.
Right? And I go, hello, if you follow that rib all the way to the top, where does it land? In the thoracic spine, right? So, and that's where we're sitting.
Right.
So what I'll see a lot of times is someone trying to get the horse to bend around the inside leg, all of their body weight, like to lift our inside leg and push inward, we necessarily have to put our body weight on the other side. You can't, it's very difficult to lift your leg on the left if your weight isn't on your right. Right? But it's our body weight to the right that's causing the whole barrel to tip right. So the horse never moves off your leg. And you think, oh, this stubborn, bullheaded horse, just listen to me. I know. I'll get a spur. That'll fix it. That'll fix it.
Did you just say that?
I did. I just said that out loud.
Okay.
I know. Doesn't solve the problem. Right. So, and this is fascinating too, because this was a hard, I'm going to read it as is, and it was a little hard to digest, but it's important because when we talk about lifting the back, dropping the back, bending the spine, and now we're adding rotation in the mix as a fourth function, right? So now we got 4 functions to think about. What he says in this is it's all related. That we could look at it forward and back, and we could look at it back to forward. It doesn't matter. So see if we can follow along on this. As is suggested by the positions of the instant center of rotation, dorsal ventral movements up and down of a vertebra can be considered either as a rotation about a transversal axis, which passes through the following vertebral body center, or as a translation along a vertical axis coupled with a rotation about a transversal axis, which passes through its own body center. What does that mean? That means you can't lift the back without affecting lateral bend and rotation. And if you affect lateral bend and rotation and you get that part right, you also increase flexion.
Yes.
It goes back and forth. Right? So what that means is, on a very practical level, if we're cranking the neck sideways and the barrel is rolling too far in and out, we're never going to get a lifted back.
Oh,
can't be done.
It's just biomechanically impossible.
Yes.
That's what boils down. That's what he's saying with all that language. It's just impossible.
Yeah. So the whole straight on a circle, straight on a turn, to me, it's a literal translation.
Oh, I like that.
It's literal.
Yes, to me, it's literal. It's like a boat. It's like turning a boat.
The boat doesn't have to bend to get around the dock, right? So same thing, I go, if the horse's midline does not feel broomstick straight and level to get around a turn, then we're working against ourselves to lift the back and even engage the hindquarters. So it's very possible. And sort of the practical demonstration I'll do is I'll take a broom or a muck fork, right? That's the center line of the horse.
Okay.
And I can do a pirouette without bending the broom or the muck fork, right? So that midline, it's the legs moving laterally, and adduction and abduction is what gets a straight, stable, level spine on a turn.
Yep.
Right? So just like our hobby horse when we were little, didn't bend, right? Didn't bend. We did walk, trot, canter everywhere, little circles.
You can even see it in the horse's development if they haven't been abducting and adducting their limbs. It's just,
How would you see that?
How would I see that?
As a body worker, what are some of the signs that you know that's, because the body development tells you about the most prevalent habits of movement. Absolutely. So what would you see on a horse that
dynamically, what would I see? Maybe a horse that stands with his feet together, his front feet or back feet, right next to each other.
Base narrow.
Base narrow.
Front or back.
Front or back. It to me, it's just an imbalance. It's not good or bad. It's just, and people get the same thing too. For instance, women tend to overwork their medial hip rotators, whereas men tend to overwork their lateral hip rotators. Men walk with their toes out, women tend to walk with their toes in. That's just an imbalance. It's something that can be fixed. It's not
absolutely
a permanent thing. This is just soft tissue. And I see the dipping in on a horse's butt on the side from the hip bone down. That's telling me
like a concavity.
Yeah, that's telling me
that muscle isn't developed.
We're not adducting, abducting at all.
Yes.
So it's, and a bigger front end than a back end. There's a horse on their forehand. So those are real.
No, and this really does tie directly into lifting the back in that if we're bending a horse like a banana on a circle, then the legs are not going to adduct and abduct in the correct direction.
Exactly.
If they adduct and abduct, they're going to go the wrong way. So we're going to weaken the muscles. And the way I see it is not only base narrow, sometimes what we call pigeon chested.
Yes.
Where the sternal muscles are developing forward and outward rather than widening the stance of the front legs. And I actually had a farrier tell me once, he was very proud that he knew how to shoe a base narrow horse and a base wide horse. And I go, I don't get it. I go, the width of the front legs is completely determined by muscle use. It's not a permanent thing. If a horse is base narrow, then they're just not strong in the adductor and abductor muscle group.
Exactly.
But I didn't see why you would shoe that horse any differently. And if I didn't go further with it, I bet I was like, yeah,
don't go there.
Next, let me interview another farrier. Yeah. So, and again, too, this lowering of the neck is mentioned, even related to lateral bending and rotation, that it appears that when the neck is lowered, the instant center of rotation of the intervertebral joints moves cranially and ventrally. So it moves forward and down the vertebral bodies. In this attitude, the spinous processes diverge, the articular facets move away, and shearing strains in the disc decrease. All of these consequences could be beneficial to back problems.
Yes, I like that.
Yeah. So long and low is like people who leave the horse in long and low too long. You have excess weight on the front legs. So it's not ideal. But if the horse has been stuck in extension, has been severely one-sided, which is going to be a lateral bending and rotation dysfunction, then long and low can be a stage to just let the body unwind. But the longer we stay there over time, we're going to have a whole different set of problems.
Right.
So I like what he says, that you're basically creating space between the vertebra. You're shifting the direction of the vertebra and the instant center of rotation, and you're decreasing shearing strains, right? It doesn't mean the horse is lifting its back. It doesn't mean your horse is athletic. It doesn't mean it's a good thing over the long term. But if you're coming out of kissing spine, it can be a productive intermediate step. Yeah.
I think so, to being pain-free for sure.
Yes. Oh, here's the sentence on the inverted rotation. If the initial positioning of the thoracic spine is in a left rotation, an added left lateral flexion induces an inverse rotation, contrary movement, with a contrary realignment of the APs and increased stress and strain on the intervertebral structures. So in other words, when that horse won't come off your leg because the barrel's rolling to the outside of your bend, the spine is in distress.
Total distress.
Yeah. A lot of shearing force, which I think is why, unless we understand lateral bending and correct lateral bending coupled with resisting rotation, really. Like
I
if
agree
we,
with that.
yeah.
I
So if,
spend a lot of time resisting rotation when I ride.
right. Because excessive rotation is always going to cause excessive lateral bending, and
Mhm.
excessive lateral bending is always going to create too much movement in the realm of rotation. So it basically, if we go way back to several podcasts, you're severely destabilizing the axial skeleton.
Yeah.
With overbending. So I think back in horror,
Yeah, me
because
too.
if you want to feel inverted rotation, sit on your horse at a halt and bend the neck sideways.
Yep.
Like,
Bingo.
oh my God. Yes. If you bend the neck left, you will feel the whole saddle roll to the right.
Yep.
If you bend the neck right, you'll feel the whole saddle go to the left. And I think in natural horsemanship, how many times I did that, I was horrified. So we learn as we go, but it's like that is not suppling your horse to bend the neck left and right. You are not suppling. You might be sort of making the neck flexible, but you're putting the back into
Jeopardy.
severe jeopardy. And I wouldn't imagine any suppleness through the back or the barrel because all those muscles have to contract to protect.
Right.
And that's really what we're feeling. So if the barrel is rolling to the inside of your path of travel, what that means is the dorsal tips of the bones are going that direction. But what's happening on the outside of the body is severe muscle contraction, or the horse would fall over.
Yeah.
So,
And then it's going to be a holding contraction too, if you think about it, which is not healthy whatsoever.
right. So it's like the boat's tipping constantly to the left, and we're straining muscularly on the right to prevent a full capsize.
Yeah.
And that dysfunction, what we feel as riders is we feel the excessive muscle contraction.
Yep.
So that's an upward force on the side that the bones are moving away from. The muscles are excessively contracting. So our saddle and our body go in the same direction as the bones, which means there's a significant weight shift to that side of the body, while the other side of the body is really having to contract muscularly just to stabilize.
Yep.
And I'll tell you what, that is possible on a straight path of travel.
It is. Oh, I agree.
It doesn't mean it only happens on a turn. So when we say we're right-handed or left-handed, or we say a horse is right-handed or left-handed or one-sided, or it manifests as one lead, one canter lead is easy, the other one you can't
You can't
get,
get. I hear that
right?
all the time.
Or the left turn is perfect, but the right turn, my horse is just so resistant, I can't get it, or vice versa. Those are all related to the functions of lateral bend and rotation.
Yes.
And it's so common. Did I say that already? I'm sure I did. I'm going to say it again. It is so common. It's a problem
It's
for every horse I've ever sat on.
yeah. And it's lack of knowledge of the riders and the trainers, how to deal with it.
Well, and to be fair, this research dates back to 1999. For the horse business, that's like yesterday, because we're still working off of theory from the 16, 17, and 1800s, right?
I know, right?
So I think that's the importance of going through this paper and talking about it in a podcast, is because it's a real problem.
It's causing a lot of, like you said, behavioral and even bony changes.
Yes.
Leading to lameness. It's huge.
And I don't doubt, sort of like before I fully understood that there was even a function called rotation or how it worked, I knew that the barrel rolling too far to the inside or outside was problematic. And if we go back through classical riding literature, I'm 100% sure that the classical masters felt the same thing and addressed it, but didn't have the explanation of it.
Right.
So it's not wrong, because horses' bodies haven't changed in, thousands of years, but it doesn't mean the explanation we had was accurate
Right.
hundreds of years ago. Right. So that's the importance of looking at research on horses, is That plus what we know from classical masters should agree in the best case scenario, right? Or it develops our understanding of what classical masters were trying to convey to us,
Yes.
right? So I think it's important, especially the horse's spine, which is the whole, like we've talked about before, the axial, the spine is protecting the central nervous system.
Mhm.
There's nothing more important for the continued function of the entire body than the central nervous system. And we straddle the spine, we work with the spine, you know, so instead of thinking shoulders and rib cage and head and neck position, when we start to think about the cervical, thoracic, lumbar spine, I think we're far more accurate at getting our horses moving in better balance. Or I use it to overcome lameness, overcome behavioral
Yeah,
issues.
all those kinematic problems.
Right. And I think was there anything else you wanted to add?
That
I
was
think
it.
we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, let's wrap it up.
Okay. Yeah. And in his summary, he goes, for each movement of flexion, extension, lateroflexion, and rotation, regional and intervertebral mobility is presented with an emphasis on craniocaudal variations and their anatomical causes. Because of the location of their instant center of rotation, the dorsal ventral movements of a thoracolumbar intervertebral joint can be defined as a rotation around the center of the more caudal vertebral body. This information supports the new concept of intravertebral mobility in the horse and provides additional elements to facilitate understanding of the pathogenesis of back problems in horses. That's a mouthful.
That was.
Yeah, you can hit replay. I'm not going to say that again. But that's part of his summary. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Oh,
We really do have to think in more dimensions.
yes.
Like to think that lateral bending is happening equally through the spine. And it's as simple as bending your horse's midline like a railroad chain of cars going around a turn. It's not that simple.
It's not that.
It's
just
much
not
more
that.
complex.
Yes,
Yeah.
I agree.
Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us for another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast. And we look forward to seeing you again. Please like, share, subscribe. And if you think this information is important, like we do, to get out in the horse world, please share. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Bye.